In this video, I just wanted to run through a quick example of HTML, JavaScript, and SVG, which can be used to create some complex simulations, like the one that I have here, whereby you can click on various buttons. And what I have here is an SVG image, and I'm interacting with the SVG image to create the simulation. So this bare bones example that I have here has all this basic elements that you require to build something more complex like this. Okay, and in this particular example, I have this SVG image, which is the red square, and when I click on it, it changes to blue. And basically, we use JavaScript to change the color, which allows the user to interact with the web page like I've done just there. So what I'd like you to be able to do after this video is to be able to set this up yourself so that you can modify this example code. And the best way to do that is to right click on this page and you can view the page source then. And when you click on the page source, this is basically the code that's used to generate or render that web page that you just seen. So the key elements of this are we have the SVG image, which is described here within this code. And I'll go through this in a bit more detail in a few moments. I've also got up here the JavaScript code, which again, I'll explain a little bit more detail in a second. But what I want to do is I'm just going to copy everything by doing Control A, right click and copy. And all you really need to modify this code is a text editor. And you can use Notepad, which most PCs will have. My own preference is Notepad++, which is available for free. And the reason why I like Notepad++ is that when you save this file as a HTML page, so I'm just going to give it an extension .html, it adds some formatting which makes the code easier to read. So again, this is referred to as a HTML document. Within the HTML document, I have the SVG image, which is described here, and I have the JavaScript code, which is here. So JavaScript is basically the way in which we can update or change the SVG image. So this is the code that we use to update the image. So let me just run through that example and I'll just describe a little bit more detail what we have on the page. So this here would be referred to as SVG element. Okay. Everything that I've highlighted there. We've got what's referred to as an opening SVG tag, and this is the closing SVG tag, just to give you some terminology. The SVG element has the following attributes. We have the width of the SVG element is 120 and the height attribute of the SVG element is 70. And within the SVG element we have another element. This is a rectangle element. Okay, and this rectangle element also has a number of attributes associated with it. We have the ID, which we're going to see is very important. It's used by the JavaScript code. So the ID is a unique ID or a unique identifier that we can then use later on to modify this particular element. So you saw in the example that we modified the rectangle, or well, it was a square because I made the size equal. We modified it by changing the color from being red to blue. Okay, so this is one of the attributes. It's the ID attribute called ID. This is the on-click attribute. The width attribute, the width of the square is 50 and the height is also 50. And we've also got another attribute called style. And the style attribute really controls how the rectangle element will appear to the user. So there's lots of features associated with the style. You can have the size of the edge of the rectangle of the square, for example. In this case, I'm just looking at one of these components of the style attribute. And in this particular case, I'm looking at the fill, which basically means the color of the main body of the square. Okay, and the fill is controlled by color, and we describe color using this RGB color format. Okay, and what I've done here is we've set the fill to be the RGB value 255, 0 and 0. Now what this means is that RGB color format has three components. It's got the amount of red, it's got the amount of blue, and the amount of green. In this particular case, the amount of red is 255, which is the maximum. The green, green is 0, and the blue component is also 0. So that's why it appears to be red at the start. Okay. The other thing then I suppose to make note of is that the attribute onClick, this particular attribute is the attribute that allows or controls the behavior of the interaction of the SVG image with the user. So in this case, when the user clicks on the rectangle element, the JavaScript function change is called. Okay, so up here in this part of the code is where I describe this function, JavaScript function called change. And when the user clicks on it, the JavaScript function change is called. And what happens here is we update the attribute style, which belongs to the element with the ID square, which is something that I defined. And again, these ID or identifiers should be unique within the entire document. Okay, so we're going to get the element with the ID square and update the style to be this value. And in this particular case, we're going to set the fill to be 0 red, 0 green, and 255 blue. And when I do that, when the user clicks on it, it's going to turn green. So maybe let's just take a look at that. So this is the location of this file. It's in the C drive, Notepad++, temp.html. So if I open up my Explorer, I can go to that page, and there's that file. When I click on it, we can test and see how it works. So in that case, I clicked on it, turns blue. If I refresh the page, in fact what I'll do is I'll edit the code a little bit now. So I might make it turn green instead. So I'll change that to 255, this to 0, and refresh the page. And now when I click, it should turn to green. So the idea behind this bare bones example is to show you the key parts of the entire simulation so that you can understand how these key components interact. So what you should take from this video is that the SVG code has elements associated with it. These elements have unique IDs, and then you can add in functionality by including other attributes. For example, if I remove this onClick change attribute now, and I'll save it, and I refresh, when I click on the square, nothing happens anymore because I've removed the interactive part of the SVG image. Okay, so there are other features or user interactions that you can include within your SVG elements. You can have things like on mouse over, So when the user moves their mouse button over the object, you can call a JavaScript function. Similarly, if you were to drag a component, you can react to that as well. So there's lots of ways that you can add interaction to an SVG image, but in order to add that interactive element to your SVG, you will need to use JavaScript code. Okay.